Usually in elections, if you can command the words new and young or change, you've got a very good chance of winning. Trump will try to command the word strong and paint Kamala Harris as weak. And I think that the Republicans who are around him, they are even more hawkish and tough on China than Democrats, although there's quite a lot of unity about that. So I think they will persuade him to seek to be tough on Taiwan and on the Taiwan issue. But there's relatively large amount of knowledge. In terms of our knowledge of China, I think it's much lower. So much more is on the basis of guesswork, I think.
Yes. So Bill Emott-san, welcome to Pivot.
I'm delighted to be with you again.
So you just released this book in Japanese and also in English.
Yes.
So what's the topic of this book? What's the theme?
The theme is war and peace. It's trying to ensure that the general tension between the US and China, tension which has dominated Japanese politics in recent years, after all, doesn't lead to World War III. And this might sound like a theoretical problem, but actually it's a very real danger. And I think World War III can be prevented. I mean, I know that it's a big thing to say, but the very important thing is that people understand what's necessary to prevent this tension turning into a real military conflict in this region. And so that's why I wrote this book.
Because the English version, the title is the Deterrence, Diplomacy, and the Risk of Conflict over Taiwan. But the Japanese version, which is quite different, is How We Can Stop World War III.
Yes.
Yes.
The meaning is the same, but the emotional impression is rather different. Yeah, exactly.
So do we need to prepare for World War III, or how close are we to the Third World War?
Well, I think we need to prepare in the sense of building up our defense capabilities, and in particular, the clear indication that these would be used in the case of a Chinese attempted invasion of Taiwan in order to show the Chinese that the costs of them trying that would be so high, so much higher compared with Russia in Ukraine, that it's not worth trying. They should not do it. And so it's a prevention strategy. You know, a little bit like your doctor tells you you need to maybe do exercise and eat properly in order to prevent illness. In defense, I think you need to build up military capabilities and show political commitment in order to prevent conflict.
What would be the most important factor to prevent World War III?
I think the key factor is the credibility of particularly the United States and Japan, but also other allies, in convincing China and your allies that if they attempt to invade Taiwan and change the status quo in that area, then you will fight them. So it's political credibility. Now, the second factor that goes with that question is, do you have capabilities, military capabilities nearby that mean that they should take this promise, this commitment seriously? And that is where Japan particularly fits in, because your defense build-up plan, which is increasing the size of the Japanese military forces, but also moving it closer down towards Taiwan, down the Nansei Islands, to Okinawa, but then beyond to Yonaguni, the nearest island to Taiwan, is important in showing that not only is this a political commitment, but if the politicians decide to say, yes, we should fight, you are able to fight in a credible and rapid way.
Do you think this is like a psychological problem so for China to think that they shouldn't invade Taiwan, or do we need to show some military strategy to stop them?
I think it's a psychological problem in which military demonstrations obviously contribute, but also the evidence of your capabilities, but most of all the evidence of your intentions. I think President Biden has been pretty sensible in saying 4 times during the 2021 and 2022, when asked, would you defend Taiwan? Would you intervene if China invaded and did what Russia has just done in Ukraine? And he said, yes, we will do that. We have a commitment. But what's critical is that successors, whether it is President Harris or President Trump, that they make the same commitment and then their successor after that. So it's the consistency there. In Japan's case, obviously a key question is the constitutional constraints that lead to doubt over your ability to follow through on deterrence strategy like that, even in the case of a crisis. So maybe there's constitutional revision may need to become a more broad interest in Japanese society, simply in order to increase the psychological impact of what you're spending money on China.
Right. So this is what I was not planning to ask you, but since you mentioned Kamala Harris and President Trump, so what do you think about, what's the impression of the presidential election in the United States so far, and how will it affect the Taiwan crisis and all the international relations?
Well, I think it's of course the question that we're all having to think about. And until last Sunday, until just a few days ago, the strange thing about this presidential election campaign was that most American voters, if they are asked in a poll, said that they don't think either candidate should be running. That they thought Joe Biden was too old, they thought Donald Trump was also too old, but also all the many things he's done meant that he should not be there. So usually voters hate one candidate and like the other. But in this case, they hated both. And they didn't want either of them. Now, one of them is gone. So what's going to be interesting and important is that you've got a candidate that everyone knows a lot about, because he was president before. He's been dominating the media for 10 years now, basically. I mean, since before he was elected, but then in his term of office and now during Biden's. Trump, everyone knows everything they're ever going to know about Donald Trump. Now there's a new person who's partially known, Kamala Harris. She's been vice president, but vice presidents are usually pretty kind of shut away in a wardrobe. I mean, they're not very public, but she's younger, she's new, and the big question is, can she use that novelty and youth as an advantage over President Trump? Usually in elections, if you can command the words new and young or change, maybe those three words, you've got a very good chance of winning. Trump will try to command the word strong and paint Kamala Harris as weak. So it's strong versus weak in his narrative. It's new versus old, change versus more of the same in her analysis. So it's going to be an interesting, almost like linguistic challenge.
So we won't know which will be the president, but let's say if Donald Trump will become re-elected, how does it affect like U.S.-China relationship?
I think that, first of all, let me say how it affects U.S.-Japan relationship, which is that I think the good news is that there'll be a lot of consistency in his approach compared with Biden, and compared with his first administration and compared with Obama. Actually. You know, this strong increase in the closeness of the alliance, support from Japan through the defense build-up and so forth. The one complication is that he threatens to put trade tariffs on all imports of manufactured goods from all countries in the world, not just China. So that includes Japan, includes my country, the UK, includes Europe. And that could lead to tension between you and a Trump administration. But militarily, diplomatically, you'll be quite close. With China, I think he's going to be quite tough on trade. What I don't know is how tough he'll be in terms of following up the Biden commitment to say, I would defend Taiwan. I have a quote in the book, which actually Josh Rogin of the Washington Post cites in his study, in which Trump said to a senator during his time of office, look, the basic fact is that Taiwan is very close to China. It's thousands of miles away from us. There's very little we can do if they decide to invade. His army, his military will tell him, no, that's wrong. We're not that far away because we're in Okinawa, we're in Sasebo.
Maybe Trump doesn't know that, but
no, exactly, but they know that. And we have submarines in the air. And so they will persuade him that he should take part. And I think that the Republicans who are around him, they are even more hawkish and tough on China than Democrats, although there's quite a lot of unity about that. So I think they will persuade him to seek to be tough on Taiwan and on the Taiwan issue. But he's unpredictable. He said to Bloomberg a few days ago that because Taiwan had basically, as he's put it, stolen the semiconductor industry from America, America should make Taiwan pay America for the defense support that it gave them. Now, I don't think this should be taken seriously, but he said it. It leaves some doubt as to what his approach will be. Most likely he will follow the Biden approach, but unpredictable.
How about Kamala Harris?
I think she would very strongly follow the Biden approach in East Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, as one should call it these days, thanks to Shinzo Abe naming it the Indo-Pacific. I think she would follow it pretty strongly. The alliance system that the Biden administration has strengthened with Japan, with Australia, with the Philippines above all, also with South Korea, I think that she will see that as a great asset, and I think that she will continue to invest in it. What she can't do very easily, which is also what Biden couldn't do, is to do more free trade arrangements with Southeast Asian countries and build a strength diplomatically with those countries and in economic ties. But that leaves a good function for Japan, which has been increasing its relationships with Indonesia, with Malaysia, with Vietnam, especially Vietnam, with Singapore, with other countries in the region. And Japan, I think, should and will continue to do that. So I think there's reasons to question what either Trump or Harris might do in Europe about Ukraine, depending on what happens in Congress. But in Asia, in Indo-Pacific, I think that Harris would be pretty strongly consistent with the Biden administration.
Right. So going back to the discussion on U.S.-China relationship. So some people call this like the new Cold War. Do you agree, or are there similarities? Are there differences? What's your take on that?
Well, I think that the difference is, key difference is that we're very, very connected.
Yes.
Economically, even in science, science collaboration, technologically, and to some degree in kind of human-to-human relations. There are tens of thousands of Chinese students studying in the West.
Yes.
I mean, in obviously in Japan, maybe it's hundreds of thousands in Japan, in the UK, in Europe, in America, which was never the case for Russia and the Soviet Union during that period. So we're much more connected. So that's a positive, that somehow there's some greater understanding. There's some greater kind of forces that say, come on, no, don't cut yourself off completely. Don't withdraw all Japanese companies from China. It's a great market, but also you're very connected.
Yes.
So that's the positive. On the negative side, I think that we lack what was there in the Cold War, which was a kind of framework of discussion about Taiwan, about nuclear weapons, especially, about the circumstances in which war might be a danger. We talk about climate change, we talk about COVID sometimes, but we don't talk about nuclear weapons and arms control because the Chinese refuse to do so.
Right.
And I think we really need to get to the point when we can achieve some sort of understanding between the two sides about the most deadly weapons in either country's arsenal.
So you're saying that during the Cold War, between Soviet Union and the United States, they might disagree on everything or maybe some points, but there were at least a common framework to discuss nuclear weapons and also other things.
It was. This was true after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So if you date the Cold War as starting in about 1948, that means you had 14 years before, when there was a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of poor communication. So it took quite a while, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, when America suspected that the Soviet Union was bringing nuclear weapons into Cuba, stationing them right next to the US. The Soviet Union were suspicious about American missiles in Turkey, sort of within range. And then such a crisis that could have led to conflict, that this then forced, or at least encouraged both sides then, once it was resolved, to set up an arms control framework and to begin talks about limiting nuclear weapons, limiting nuclear testing, and this kind of thing. It took, again, like 2 decades before it really kind of achieved a mature level. But I think our challenge with China is to get that started.
Yeah.
It's a long-term prospect.
Can we get started? How can we get started?
Well, I think it does depend on the Chinese realizing that it's necessary. And it may take time before they do that.
Right.
Partly because they have a much smaller nuclear arsenal compared with the US.
Right.
And so they've got a strong incentive to try to close the gap. So they don't really want to talk about controlling that while they're expanding. But particularly if there was a crisis over something, which could happen over something relatively seemingly small, like the Philippines and clashes in the South China Sea, or it could happen over Taiwan. I think maybe then the Chinese leadership could start to see that, wait a minute, this is really pretty dangerous for us as well as for them. Maybe we need a framework. So you can't predict it. Can't say this could happen in 3 years' time or 5 years or whatever, but it's got to be the target that we all try to reach.
So in your book, you mentioned also the psychological side of U.S.-China relationship. Do you think that both countries should each know their motivation, their responses, and their ambitions much more?
I think they should, both of them, be making every effort to try to understand each other's motivations. And typically, the sort of at least superficial fact is that because America is a pretty open society, the Chinese know a lot about it.
Yes, they can read it about it.
They can read about it.
Economist or the newspaper.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. They can debate Biden, Harris. They can debate Harris versus Trump.
Right.
They can do exactly the same things as you and I are doing. Whether they really understand underneath it what the what the thinking is, what's behind some of the things they're saying, I don't know, because they're not probably discussing this in a very open way, person to person, in the way that perhaps they might have done 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But there's relatively large amount of knowledge. In terms of our knowledge of China, I think it's much lower. We've got all sorts of knowledge of the economy and of companies and technology and so forth, but knowledge of the way decisions are made, of the way of the relationships. So much more is on the basis of guesswork, I think.
Yes.
And supposition about well, who might really be the influential person and so forth. And that's a bit dangerous, I think. So, I don't know how you change that.
Right.
But we clearly need to make every effort to get to know. And some of it's through intelligence, through James Bond, if you like. But much of it has to be through trying to encourage dialogue and getting more people involved in dialogue at different levels. So just in order to build a kind of a broader picture.
Do you think there are enough dialogues, or do you think there should be more dialogue between the two nations?
I think there were enough, and then particularly during COVID, and then in the tension that came out of COVID, and now in the tension that's about technology of a broader kind, the number of dialogues have diminished. And of course, the Chinese tendency to arrest people who come and stay and visit the country, Japanese researchers or Canadian business people, and so forth, is pretty discouraging for dialogue, to say the least. The International Institute for Strategic Studies does not typically send people into China because of that security risk, because people before have been arrested, with no apparent reason for doing it. So that is a big obstacle to dialogue. We're very happy that the Chinese send very good delegation to the big event that we have in Singapore every year, called the Shangri-La Dialogue, which has public components but also private components. So there's quite a lot of military-to-military dialogue, and dialogue among officials can take place in that kind of format. But at sort of deeper levels, it's not as much as it needs to be, I'd say.
But there's a chance to understand each other through those
There is at least that, yes, exactly, which is good. Yes, yeah.
So let's talk about Taiwan. So in your book, there's a map of the East Asia and Taiwan right here.
Yes.
So could you elaborate on the geopolitical importance and significance of Taiwan from a geopolitical point of view?
Well, I think that Taiwan has two different types of geopolitical importance. One type is the historical importance, but the other type is a geographical and strategic importance. Usually people talk about the history more than the geography. I start with the geography. The thing about Taiwan, which of course is why in 1895,
Yeah.
Japan was very happy to receive it in the Treaty of Shimonoseki after the Sino-Japanese conflict, because its geographical position dominates that very important area of ocean in between the East China Sea and the South China Sea, really the Western Pacific. So Taiwan is like a floating aircraft carrier, as one might think of it. And so, although currently nobody possesses it except the Taiwanese people themselves, and before 1979, when the US changed its diplomatic relations away from the from Taiwan, from the Republic of China to the Communist China, to the People's Republic, and moved its bases out of Taiwan. Since then, America hasn't been there. But if either could dominate it and control it, that would give them control over the busiest shipping lanes in the world, and give whichever of them the chance to dominate the region because of the pressure it would allow them to put on all the countries in the region, be it Malaysia, be it Vietnam, be it the Philippines, be it Indonesia, be it Singapore. So that's the strategic importance. The historical importance is that it was the base to which the nationalist Chinese, led by Chiang Kai-shek, escaped after being defeated in 1949 by the communists in the Chinese Civil War, and then for decades persisted in claiming that they were the rightful government of the whole of China. And so for the Chinese, ending that war and taking over what became the nationalist enclave has a big significance. Secondly, for the Chinese, of course, it was a Japanese colony for half a century, from 1895 to 1945. Again, from a Chinese point of view, they haven't completed, if you like, a certain part of history without taking that. So there is a strong nationalistic historical reason. But in my view, if that was the only thing that existed, probably it would not be a potential cause for World War III. You could find ways to kind of finesse that. But because there's a geopolitical and military advantage to it, the arguments in favor on the Chinese side of taking the risk are stronger, and the arguments in favor of preventing this happening are also stronger. Because from an American point of view and from a Japanese point of view, the question would have to be, for the public opinion in any country, is it worth fighting a conflict over this island, wonderful and successful though it is, but it's an island of 40 million people. Do you want to send your sons and daughters to die over that? And from an American point of view, the answer to that would be no if it was just history, I think. But because it's geopolitical strategy, the answer becomes yes, at least in my interpretation. And so it's that combination.
It might lead to United States losing this their position as the only superpower, because if China can expand to Taiwan, they can expand further.
Yes, exactly. It would give China the opportunity to challenge, as you say, global leadership. And currently no power controls the Indo-Pacific, which is a very good situation in many ways. It's enabled everyone to flourish. But suddenly you would have potentially one power controlling it. And I think that worries a lot of people. So that is why it's so important. The historical claims are important to the psychology of the Chinese leadership and in the public opinion view of China. But in Europe, I live in Ireland. Ireland spent 800 years as a colony of the United Kingdom, of England. So I'm a terrible imperialist from my Irish neighbor's point of view. But if I said to my Irish neighbors, "Oh, come on, we were so here for such a long time, we surely have a claim to Ireland now," they would throw me out. So for China to say, "Come on, we have a historical affinity to Taiwan," is equally, I think, nonsensical in a modern world. But psychologically, it matters. But it's not a legal claim or historical claim that has any real function. And the new generations of Taiwanese people definitely feel Taiwanese and not Chinese.
Yes. So in your book, there's a chapter about Taiwan, and there's changes in the unification, also the independence stances of Taiwanese people since the 1990s to 2023.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on this?
Yes. No, I think what opinion polls show is that two big things have changed. The first of all, what's changed is that when asked a question, do you favor independence? Do you favor the status quo? Do you favor unification with the PRC, with China? Or do you favor, slow movement in either direction? The number of people favoring unification has gone down and was overtaken essentially in the 1990s by the number of people favoring the status quo plus the number of people favoring independence. Independence is not dominant, but if you add those two, status quo, leave us alone.
Yes,
and can
that's
we
the
be,
message.
Yes, exactly. Leave us alone is the message. Favoring independence is a kind of sovereignty. We want our own identity and sovereignty one. If you then look at the identity of people in Taiwan, do they feel Chinese first and Taiwanese second? Do they feel Taiwanese first and Chinese second? Do they feel Taiwanese only? If you went back into the 1950s and 1960s, partly because there had been quite a lot of immigration because of the nationalists escaping from the mainland, but also sort of some kind of historical ties of that kind. But from before, there were quite a lot of people who said we are Chinese who happen to be in Taiwan. Really a bit further ago, but particularly strongly from the early 1990s onwards, the number of people saying we're simply Taiwanese. Particularly because they are probably born in Taiwan, they are raised in Taiwan, they have only ever been Taiwanese. They are now by far the dominant sentiment. So I think that reinforces the leave us alone kind of basic sentiment.
This poll makes sense because I visited Taiwan during the election in January, and I talked to the citizens. They were talking about, for instance, LGBTQ issues, democracy, semiconductors. So I felt that they had like a kind of a unique culture of their own right now in the modern world. Yes, and they feel they have a different society compared to China.
Absolutely, yes. No, they know that they have kind of Chinese heritage and culture, but they also have embraced what was their indigenous population as well, which has essentially a Polynesian kind of origin, going back thousands of years. And so forth, and then born in Taiwan and only in Taiwan, and Chinese immigrants. So they feel that they are their own unique mix. And as you say, they are a democracy. They are a very open, vibrant, free speech society where equal rights have developed probably faster than most other Asian countries, even when they are democracies, because to some degree of that special character of Taiwan. So definitely, it feels like a very special place, even though there are still, monuments to Chiang Kai-shek and sort of, some of that kind of grandiose period, but most of them have been taken down.
Since we're talking a lot about the psychological effects of international relations, how do you think identity takes part in the modern world? Do you think it's becoming more and more important of like national identity or identity about their culture, or how does identity take a part?
I think it's quite paradoxical in a way to me. I'm somebody who travels the world. I used to live in Japan. I come to Japan often. I go to Italy often. I live in Ireland and not in the UK. So for me, I feel my identity is English, but also very international. And I feel that the information that I have access to in the information age, the internet age, is also incredibly diverse and widespread. And yet, identity politics has grown. We see it in America,
Europe,
the America First movement. J.D. Vance and all of that, strongly identity based. In Europe, absolutely strongly, including also in the UK. Why is that? So I think it's because of some economic stress that makes you fear the outside world and things that are outside your control.
Unsecured,
loss of a sense of security. That people feel, and therefore they want to, make things closer and so forth. Some loss of local community, as maybe some places become more kind of standardized, if you like. I think that's maybe particularly true in the UK, actually, sometimes. We feel a little bit, there are too many McDonald'ses.
Too many McDonald's. Okay.
I think we lost the American battle a long time ago, but so I'm kind of kidding, but but it's part of that sense of loss of localness. So there's some reaction and counter-reaction. But most people who say, "Oh God, I think identity is so important today," and then if your next question to them is, "Where are you going on vacation?" they would say, "Yeah, I'm just going to Greece, or I'm just going to Bali."
Yeah, and drink Starbucks
and drink,
eat McDonald's.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we have a mixed
feeling. Yes.
Most people have a mixed feeling, even J.D. Vance.
Yeah. True. So after Taiwan, I wanted to talk about Japan. So you have a whole chapter explaining the role of Japan. So what's the role of Japan in how to prevent the World War III and how to prevent the Taiwan crisis?
Well, I think Japan's role is pretty critical, particularly because of its geographical position. As you have lived throughout your existence as a nation, being so close to China, being so close to Korea, being so close to Russia, gives you and being an archipelago that extends so widely through geography, gives you a critical interest in the stability and peace of the neighborhood. Yeah. But now I think the special point is that not only thanks to the security treaty with the United States are you the principal overseas base for American forces, both naval and air force and Marines, but also your islands are the closest islands to Taiwan. So, from the point of view of Japan's interest in maintaining peace, you suddenly feel that actually you would be affected incredibly directly if war were to break out. And I think you've begun to feel a responsibility to try to contribute to preventing it, which is obviously quite a historic change, driven by somewhat by Shinzo Abe, as Prime Minister, but now really being delivered by the current administration. So I think that has that awareness that really you are on the front line, and that you therefore need to do a lot to kind of defend the front line, to make sure that prevention can be believed and credible, I think really is where Japan fits in. Japan so is critical in what you spend money on your defense, in the military capabilities you produce, but also I think you're pretty important in the relationships that you have with other countries in the Indo-Pacific, with the Southeast Asian countries. And your relationship with them is much more profound and deep than the Americans' relationship can be, because America is so far away, and America is so big and self-obsessed in a way. By nature, that's what big countries are like. But you are in the region, and so your connections with Indonesia, with Vietnam and the other countries have many more levels to it. And that means you're important in persuading those countries that they need to not join one side or the other. They need to also contribute to keeping the status quo unchanged, to discouraging violence, to deterring military action by anybody. And so I think Japan is directly important, but then indirectly important as an influence on other countries.
How can we build trust, especially within the countries in East Asia, because of the historical, what happened in World War II? It was very difficult for Japan to have military power, because that will maybe seem to lead to another Japanese regime of imperial Japan. But I feel change that the defense budget has increased to 2% of GDP. You feel that change not only within Japan, but outside Japan, especially in the East Asian countries? Do you feel there's a change of view towards Japan?
Well, I think there is a change of view towards Japan. I think in many countries, obviously the Philippines is the most obvious one. There's a sense that Japan is not just a friend in theory, but it's a friend in practice, because you're making direct efforts to help their Coast Guard fleet. You're giving them grants to help defend. strengthen their own capabilities. You are there for them in a way that perhaps 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you couldn't be and wouldn't be. So I think for some countries, it's very real. Other countries, I think what is necessary, maybe more than has been done so far, is a great deal of clarity and transparency about why you're doing this, what it is you're doing, and maybe get them more involved directly to see what you're doing, so that any kind of residual belief that, oh, this is threatening in some way because of, as you say, that historical memory can be removed.
Yeah.
But to show you're not doing anything in secret, you're not doing anything kind of sinister.
Yeah.
You're doing something that's in the regional interest. And I know that's obviously said at the top level in the speeches and rhetoric, but I think maybe more effort, still more effort at convincing at every other level in society it would be a good investment.
One more factor is that domestic politics in Japan, and because of the Constitution, Article 9.
Yes.
And also, you mentioned about komeito in your book.
Yes.
So how will affect, what's the impression of komeito and how will that change or affect the Japanese defense policies?
Well, my impression is that komeito are a drag, a sort of a force to slow down this process.
Yes.
Because of their own heritage and their Buddhist background. But the evidence of the Abe period and since is that while they may slow things down, they don't stop it altogether. They force it to be more thought through, maybe more discussed, more open. but they're not really a strong obstruction. And I think that reflects a public change of view about what's the nature of the activity we are talking about. Is this militaristic, or is it about maintaining peace in a different way? And I think komeito are persuadable that pacifism requires this kind of preparation in order to prevent war. Now, reluctantly, of course, because it does conflict with a lot of philosophy, but I think the evidence of the way that they have reluctantly let things happen suggests to me that they're persuadable, or at least they're persuadable to not stand too strongly in the way.
Right. How about the Nippon Ishin no Kai? Because in your book you also mentioned about Ishin no Kai. It's very complicated because basically the LDP has teamed up with komeito for, frankly speaking, to win the election.
Yes.
But if Ishin no Kai were to replace komeito, what would happen and how that would affect Japanese defense policy?
Well, they're quite hard to judge at least from an outsider point of view, Ishin no Kai, because they're quite new, but also it's unclear in a way how strong their organization is. Why do I stress that? Because I think the immediate effect would be to help accelerate this process. They're clearly, more if you like, in left-right terms, they're right-wing. They are clearly more in hawkish on these issues. They would help to support it. But the big question politically must be: are they sustainable? Because they are a group of people, but are they an organization? And they may support us for these few years, but will they still exist?
Right. Especially compared to komeito, because they're a strong.
Exactly. Yes. Komeito may be declining, certainly, but they have an organization. They have Soka Gakkai. They are a well-established party, whereas the Ishin no Kai, the question must be, who are they really? There were so many parties that were invented in the 1990s, I've been, in my long time, I'm afraid, watching Japanese politics, I've lost count of the number of
no
parties.
One remembers.
No, exactly. How could you keep track of all of these parties? And Ozora Ichiro was involved with a lot of them.
A lot of Yuiko Korike.
Yeah, absolutely. They all kind of
moved around.
And so if I was Prime Minister Kishida or his successors, I'd be thinking, are these people really for, are they for real? Are they, where will they be in 5 years' time?
So we need to kind of wrap up. So in your book, you mentioned the quote by Kishida Fumio in the Shangri-La dialogue in June that Ukraine today may be in East Asia tomorrow.
Yes.
So what's your conclusion of your book? So what can we do to prevent World War III, and how should Japan respond, and how should the world react to this circumstance? Right.
I mean, my conclusion is essentially that we need to have very credible military capabilities. That the old Roman saying, which was, if you want peace, prepare for war, makes sense. Even 2,000 years later, you have to show that you've got the capabilities, that the potential adversary takes you seriously.
Yes.
But at the same time, we do need to work towards getting a kind of framework to ensure that we all understand the role of nuclear weapons. We all understand that if we got into a conflict, that nuclear weapons could make it the worst conflict that the world had ever seen. And that understanding, once shared, as it was between the US and the Soviet Union after the Cuban Missile Crisis, can act as a restraint against other forms of conflict as well, because the risks are just too high. It becomes inconceivable on either side that you could take the risk of having the planet destroyed. So that might seem quite apocalyptic, but I think that the possibilities are apocalyptic if you get nuclear weapons seriously considered by either side. So the important thing must be build up conventional forces to be credible. If you want peace, prepare for war. But at the same time, understand each other about nuclear weapons and set up a framework about it diplomatically.
Do you think we should talk more about nuclear weapons? Because you also mentioned that we have a lot of things to talk about, like AI or global warming. Or do you think we should talk more about nuclear weapons?
I do actually think we need to talk more again about nuclear weapons. Yes, we used to talk obsessively about nuclear weapons during the Cold War when I was young. But now we've kind of put it to one side. And the experience of the war in Ukraine says they can be used as a threat, but probably they won't be used. But they're quite a potent threat, but he hasn't actually used anything, so therefore it's okay. Whereas I don't think we can depend on that. They're really too ghastly, too destructive to not talk about them. And I think we need to raise it up the agenda, particularly between the US and China.
How about communication between the leaders? Because during the Cuban crisis, Khrushchev and President Kennedy had kind of direct kind of communication to prevent destroy of the world. So do you think there should be more communication between the world leaders?
Well, I think certainly we need to make sure that there is regular communication between, Beijing, between the leadership in Beijing, Xi Jinping currently, and the White House, and between their militaries, so that they can, if something looks like it's happening, they can pick up the phone and say, "Is this happening?
Are you seeing this?
Is
this right?
Is this right?" Exactly. And that is what was achieved during the Cold War. Not perfect, but nonetheless, it improved things a lot. And in recent years, the US and China have gone up and down in that. Some sense that they don't know what's going on, and then contact is resumed, and everyone feels they could breathe again, and then it's lost again. So it needs to be pretty regular. I think that. But we need to understand that this is a fundamental geopolitical contest between great powers. And in the Japanese version of the book, I give a more kind of broad analysis of the geopolitics within which this goes, because for the English readers of this book, for the International Institute for Strategic Studies, they live and breathe that issue. They're specialists, whereas this is more for the general reader. And that great power competition is something that's not going to go away. It's going to be for the rest of my lifetime, I think for the rest of your lifetime, and we need to find a way to manage it.
Great. So I highly recommend this book to our audience. So I think we should read both of the editions if it's possible, because like you mentioned, there's some different parts in the Japanese chapter and also the English chapter. So yeah, I recommend this to our audience. So Bill Emott, thank you for joining our conversation.
It was great to be with you. Very enjoyable conversation.